welcome back to Gold's Garage. So in this video we're going to do three things for you. One of the things we're going to do is start up Paul Vanderspek's 355 engine, and this engine is going on the dyno on March the 1st, and it's going to be a shootout comparison of these NASCAR heads on the 355 versus, and they are old school stuff, 1970 angle plug 292 heads, how they do compared to exactly the same engine with a Pro Max or another aftermarket cylinder heads. So that's one of the things we're going to do in this video. So this engine was the subject of I think 5 or 6 videos. We tried to show as much detail along the way of how this engine was built. One of the things we missed was adjusting the valves. A viewer asked me to show that, so we're going to take that a step further. We're going to take you a valve adjustment 101 from the beginning of time to where we are today. So please like and subscribe. 3 parts. I'm going to tell you about how hydraulic valve lifters work, how to adjust them, various ways to adjust them. Then we're going to show you adjusting them, then we're going to fire up the engine. So stay with us. We got lots more to come. So first of all, we're going to talk about hydraulic valve lifter adjustment. Now, most of the things I'm talking about apply to solids, except that one has a clearance or one doesn't. But and at the end, I'll make a comment. If you have a race car with a solid roller camshaft with big numbers, you probably want to check out Brian Salter's got a great video on how to adjust valves. I will cover that off actually in this video, but his takes it to another level. So you might check that out. So let's talk about, first of all, hydraulic valve lifters. What's the difference? Why is it important? And then we'll talk about various ways of adjustment. Okay, so just to give you a little intro on that, back in when I worked at the Texaco Garage back in the 60s and the early mid 60s, it was typical for customers to come in twice a year for a tune-up. And so we changed all the spark plugs, we installed new points and condenser, we set the dwell, we set the timing, and we actually took the valve covers off and readjusted the hydraulic valve lifters. Say a typical 283 or 235/6 or whatever. We didn't have to do that. I'm not sure if we just did it but anyway, we didn't have to do that. One of the points about hydraulic valve lifters, and it applies if I build an engine, I set the lifters before the very first startup, and I never touch them again. And there's no reason to touch them again. They're good for the life of the engine. And that's one of the benefits of a hydraulic valve lifter, is there's no noise. So what are the other benefits? So prior to the 1950s, early 1950s, most engines had solid valve lifters. So I've got one of each. These are flat tappet lifters. There are rollers as well. And you'll notice one's painted red and one's not. And the reason I painted red is because they look so much alike. I'm afraid I use this one for degree in camshafts because it's solid. I'm afraid to leave it in an engine if I'm not paying attention. So I paint it red for that reason. Because when you look at them, it's very difficult to tell the difference. Now, one way you could tell if you have that dilemma is take a push rod and push into each of the lifters. If it's hydraulic, you'll feel a little depression. If it's solid, you won't, because the solid lifter has also got a circle up. That's just part of the manufacturing process. It's not really solid inside. There's cavities for oil to flow, etc. But a hydraulic valve lifter, on the other hand, is different. So a hydraulic valve lifter is probably the most complex part of any engine, and we take them for granted because we don't really do much to them, but they are very complex. So what does hydraulic mean? The term hydraulic means that they operate based on fluid pressure. So where's that fluid pressure? That's the oil pressure from your engine. So, and what are the benefits of it? In the early days before them, a solid valve lifter had, when you adjusted the valve train, and the valve train is the camshaft, the valve lifter, the push rod, rocker arm, and the valve and the spring. When you adjusted it, you set a clearance, or a lash. It was also called a lash. So the Duntov 3030 cam, by the way, one of the reasons they called it that was because it had 30 thousandths of valve lash. Okay, so why was that there? Because it has to accommodate thermal expansion. When the engine starts up, everything grows according to its own thermal expansion, and that's different for all the components. So the clearance is going to change. So if you adjusted the valve train with no clearance, when you started it up, you would probably have a valve that's not going to close. So valve lash was the solution for that. So on a hydraulic valve lifter, there is no lash. There's actually a preload, and that's what we're going to show you today. So what are we trying to accomplish by a preload? In order for the valve lifter to work, we set zero clearance, first of all, so there's no clearance on the valve train from the camshaft, valve lifter, push rod, rocker arm, etc. And then we apply a preload, let's say for now a half a turn preload. And what that does is depresses the hydraulics, so now it accommodates variability as the engine expands, the heat temperature expands, etc. And it comes into a play when at high RPM when your valves are trying to float as well. So that's what the difference between a hydraulic lifter is. So let's cover that off first of all. So typically if you're adjusting, and I'm going to use an engine like a Chevrolet that has rocker arm studs. Some have rocker arm shafts, that's a little different. Rocker arm studs. So the studs are usually 3/8 or 7/16 of an inch. So the pitch of a 3/8 thread, a 3/8 thread has 24 threads per inch. So if you divide that into one, it's 20 thousandths of an inch. A 7/16 has 20 threads per inch. You divide that into one, you have 25 thousandths of an inch. That's how you determine valve lash. So if you follow my thinking here, if you provide zero clearance and you turn a half a turn, if you have a 7/16 thread, then you're depressing 25 thou. If you have a 3/8 thread, you're depressing 20 thou. So that's what you're doing. So it's not very much, but it accommodates all the things that are going to happen when the engine fires up. So that's the difference. Hydraulic valve lifters are quieter, they're easier on the valve train, they last longer, and they never need maintenance, whereas solid valve lifter engines typically get adjusted numerous times depending on the application. Let's talk about the various ways of adjusting valves. And once again, there's lots of ways. They probably all work if you do them right. And everybody whatever method they use, think it's the best or the only method to be used. It's the right method to be used. And I don't really care about all that. I'm going to show you all the methods that I'm aware of at the moment. And you can decide which one you want to use for yourself. So back in the early days when we did tune-ups, we did change the spark plugs, installed new points and condensers, set the dwell, set the timing, took the valve covers off, and adjusted the valve lifters. Probably didn't have to do that, but we thought we did, and certainly those were the early days. By the way, the creation or invention of hydraulic valve lifters was prior to that, but manufacturing before the OEMs were using them on a lot of engines was early 50s, probably Cadillacs first. Typically, they got those kind of things earlier. But by 1955, when the small block Chev was created or invented or came out, it had hydraulic valve lifters. Okay, so and every small block Chev, except the high performance ones, still do. So back then, we actually set the valve lifters with the engine running. Now, a 283 back then would idle at 400 RPM. We took the valve cover off, and we basically one at a time backed off the rocker arm nut until we heard a clickety-clack, and we tightened it down until the noise went away, and then we turned it one full turn, because that was the recommendation according to the GM manual, was one full turn. And you probably could still do that and it would still work, by the way, but we don't do that now. So we went along one side to the other and readjusted the valves, and in the end we probably didn't really change anything. But also on a startup of an engine, first cams I ever changed in the 60s, I didn't know half the things I'm telling you today. So we got them all kind of close, and we started the engine up and the valves were clacking away, and we just kept tightening them down until we got them all quieted down, and by that time we had oil splashed all over the place and stuff, but it worked. But that's not the way I'm going to recommend you do today. So the next way is the way that the GM manual tells you to do it, and you've watched my videos before. You know, my standard saying is, you know, these guys are pretty smart. They knew what they were doing. They created these engines, so they know how to do stuff to them. So the way they recommended it, I'm going to put I have a little display up here of the method, and Mike's going to put a screenshot of that for you, showing you that process. So you can actually set all the valves. First of all, you have to find number one firing, and make sure you're at the starting point that your distributor rotor is pointing to number one cylinder, so it's on the firing of number one cylinder. And there's this, and I will give you all that information. There's select number of valves that you can set in that position. Rotate the engine around until number 6 is firing. Remember that the balancer turns twice every time the rotor turns. Okay, so the balancer comes around again at number 6 firing, and you can set the rest of the valves. That works. And on the startup of a new engine, nothing wrong with doing that, providing those engines they were referring to had pretty mild cams, less than 200 degrees of duration, way less than a half an inch, less than 350 thousandths or 400 thousandths of lift. Pretty mild cams, so it was safe to do it that way. GM also had another way where you had to use 4 rotations, and if you buy a new ZZ6 crate engine or ZZ4 or CT400, and also known as the 602, 604 race crate engines, the recommended method that they recommend is 4 positions that are required, okay? And that's because the camshafts are a little bigger, the valve's off, the valve lifter is off the base circle more often. So you start at number 1 firing, and you turn a half a turn. So number 1 firing, you set 4. You turn it a half a turn, set the other 4. Another half a turn, set the other 4. Another half a turn, set the last 4. And this, we'll put a screenshot of this thing I have behind me here, which describes the exact valves that you can set. And that works just fine. You can do that. And one of the advantages of methods like that is that it minimizes the amount of times that you turn the engine. So one of the things, if you're building an engine and you're putting in a flat tappet cam, it's not a problem with a roller cam, but if you have a flat tappet cam, you do not want to turn that engine any more than you absolutely have to. So by doing it the methods that I just described to you, you will minimize the amount of times that the engine has to turn over. So, and back to that, the other way, if you can't get your rotor cap off or you can't see where your pointer is, take number 1 spark plug out. We will demonstrate that actually in the next section of this video when we actually adjust the valves. So the way that I do it now is a little different than that, and I start at, it doesn't really matter where you start. I look at where the balancer is, and I start off with a balancer that is like this, and I'm going to get Ali to come around here because this makes more sense if you look at this. The firing order on a lot of engines, whether a small block or big block, should have 1, 8, 4, 3, 6, 5, 7, 2. So on the first rotation, don't forget the balancer is going to turn twice every time the rotor turns once. You're going to get 1, 8, 4, 3. You're back up to number 6, where the pointer on your balancer is at 0 again. 5, 7, 2. So typically what I'll do with a new, and hard to show it on the engine here, is I mark a balancer like this. As the engine rotates, the first time I'll do 1, 8, 4, 3, 6, 5, 4, 2 on the second round. So I just set the first 2 valves. So if we start at number 1 cylinder, where the engine, where it's number 1 spark plug, top dead center, firing for number 1 cylinder, we know both those valves are closed, and I'm going to show you here how you can prove that. And the valve lifter is off the base circle. Set both those valves, rotate the balancer 90 degrees, set the next one, rotate the balancer 90 more degrees, and so on. So with 2 rotations of the balancer, all your valves are set. And that's typically one of the reasons I do that. I don't want to turn the engine any more than I have to. And so why is that safe? So there's number 1 firing. If you look at this rotation, the 4 parts of an engine is the combustion cycle: intake, compression, power, and exhaust. So in the intake stroke, okay, is blue, is green, and then compression is the red, as orange, then red, then blue. So what I'm trying to show you though is TDC number 1 firing. The intake valve has been closed for 100. I'm using a Comp 276 HR cam stats for this, so you know I'm not just making it up. The intake valve has been closed already because it closed right here for 116 degrees before you get there. And the exhaust valve is not going to open till about 105 degrees after top dead center. So both valves, the valve lifters are off the base circle of the cam, and it's safe to set the lifters. I guess it should be an obvious point. You want to set your valves when your camshaft is on the base circle, when the valve lifter is on the base circle and not on the active part of the lobe. So that's why that's safe and that works. So we're going to actually demonstrate that in the next section of this video. So the next way is more typical. Most race, if you have a big race car engine, I think I mentioned already, Brian Salter has a great video on this subject. If you have a big cam, solid roller camshaft where you have what's called clearance ramps, etc., probably the best method to use in that case is the method where you set the intake where the exhaust starts to open, and you set the exhaust when the intake is closing. So let's look at that for a minute. So if you want to set the intake valve, okay, when the exhaust valve starts to open, we're at 105 degrees down here. So the exhaust valve has the complete opening and closing again, okay. The intake has to open, have combustion, and come around again. So your intake valve is definitely not a problem. If you have your exhaust valve opening, your intake valve is safe to adjust. You want to be off the base circle. So next, the exhaust valve when the intake valve is closing. So if you have a typical center line of the cam on an intake valve, it's around 105, 106 degrees. So the intake valve is at its peak here. It's starting to close, okay? And that's the intake valve there, sorry. It's starting to close. And so the farther you get away from this point, the easier it is, or the safer it is to set your exhaust valve. Typically, as long as the intake valve is closing, you're getting away from the exhaust valve. So set your intake when the exhaust valve starts to move. Set your exhaust when the intake valve starts to close. Once again, if you want to see a better detail of that, Brian's got a pretty good video showing, actually displaying that. I'm going to display setting hydraulic valve lifters here today. So hope you found that helpful. Now, did I miss anything? I think I covered. There's another method actually that I typically, if I'm going to make a video, I look and see what other videos are already out there. And there's a couple of videos that I found which were on something I never thought of. And I should have mentioned at the beginning. So typically what they do, they put all the rock arms on. They don't care where the engine is. They adjust all the lifters, all the rock arms to 0 lash, not preload yet, 0 lash. Turn the engine half a turn, do that again. Turn it another half a turn, do that again, another half a turn, and finish them all. Now, why that works is because the valve lifter is off the base circle more than half of the time. So if you do that, you're going to cover all the points. In fact, after one rotation, you'll probably have 3/4 of them already be at 0 lash. So by doing that 4 times, you'll catch them all. So you have all your valve lifters at 0 lash, and then you just go along and adjust your preload, whatever preload you want to use, a half a turn, 1/4 turn. Now, let me cover that off. The GM manual in 1968 said a full turn. The GM performance manual for a CT400 race engine, I have one, I haven't got it here, trust me, in the same manual it actually gives you two different recommendations. One is a quarter turn and the other one's 3/4 of a turn. So I like compromise. Typically I aim for about a half a turn. You'll be just fine with that. If you have a reason that you want to go, then there are reasons based on what works best for valve float, etc. I'm not going to get into that in this video. Be my guest, do it any way you want. But following that process, just tightening them all down, rotate, keep rotating the engine until you catch them all. Now you got them all at 0 lash, now you got to preload them all. So you go along and preload them all and you are good to go. And that actually, there's probably nothing wrong with doing it that way. So the difference is this. If you do it that way, you don't really know what's going on, have to know what's going on. And if you know, you heard my points before, if you understand it, you own it. I'd rather do it in a way that's methodical, that I understand and makes sense to me. But those are the various ways. So we're going to cap off this part of the video. We're going to take the valve covers off and show you some valve adjustments and the next clip, and then we're going to fire this bad boy up for you. Okay, in this clip, I'm going to try to show a process that I use. Not saying it's the only or the best one. There's lots of ways to do it. Just the process I just described, where I bring each cylinder to top dead center. Both intake exhaust valves are closed. Both lifters are well off the ramps. They're on the base circle of the camshaft, and it's safe to set the valves. So you don't have to start at number 1. You can start wherever you want, but just to make it simple, I mocked up for starting at number 1. I got the distributor cap loose here. So if you don't know, if your distributor engine's been running already, you take the cap off whenever the pointer is at number 1. That's all you need to know. But if you don't know that, one of the other ways to find out where number 1 firing is to check compression. Because remember, the balancer comes around twice for every rotation of the distributor. One of the times is the overlap cycle. You don't want to be adjusting anything on the overlap cycle. You want to be adjusting it on the compression stroke, okay, when both valves are closed. So make sure we know that. One of the things we'll do is I've took a spark plug out already. Look at my nice little organizer. My wife buys this stuff for me, and she thinks I want what's in it, but I really like the containers more than anything. But so took the spark plug out already, number 1 spark plug out, and put my finger in the hole and pump the engine over. Oh, felt it right there. And you know what? I got lucky. I went a little past. So let me go around. We're going to come around again just to make it, just to validate what I did, Alec. That was too easy. So there's number 1 up again, but this time it's pointing at number 6 because there is no compressions, right? I went around again. There we go. We're at TDC, and you know what? It's not quite at 0, but that is actually okay. When you're doing this, once again, your valve lifters are off the base circle of the cam more than half the time, way more than half the time. A few degrees each side is fine. So just to verify that, I take my cap off, and guess what? There's number 1 on the distributor cap, and there's the rotor pointing to number 1. So if it was pointing to number 6, then I'd know I didn't get it right, but it's pointing to number 1. So that's all I need to know. So now to set the valves. So the first part is, with my method, you have to know where the crankshaft is, where the camshaft is, etc. in this method. So that's number 1. We already know that. We're at TDC or close enough to TDC. It doesn't have to be exactly, once again, for the reasons that I mentioned. So now the method. So what we're trying to do is the rocker arm is going to provide the adjustment. These rocker arm studs are 3/8 of an inch. So for every half a turn, I'm going to actually depress 20 thousandths of an inch, for the way I just described that. So all I do is I got to get my fingers in here so I can feel, and you can get a feel for this. I screw down got to make sure, one thing you have to make sure is that your locks are backed off so that you're not getting a false reading where your lock bottoms out before you get to the lifter where you want it. So lock, twist the push rod in your fingers until you feel, and I'm feeling it right there. The push rod is turning easily, and there it stops. So that's good. That's all I need to know. I'm going to do the other one now. Twisting the push rod, tighten it down. That's all I need to know. So now I put my preload in it. Now in my case, I'm aiming for a half of a turn. So typically what I will do is put my box end wrench on here and turn it a little less than a half a turn, then lock down with my adjuster and jam them all in together. So that's, if the half a turn is going to be over here, I'm going to stop. I can feel it pushing the valve, the push rod into the valve lifter, into the plunger as I do this. Stop about here. Now I'm going to tighten the adjuster down, the lock nut as much as I can, and jam them together. There we go. That's done. Same thing with the other one. That's the exhaust, by the way. That's the intake. So we'll do the same thing. So a little less than half a turn. Lock down with the lock nut, jam them together. That's all I need to know. Now, typically, I will do that. Now I'll rotate the crankshaft once again a half a turn. I've got the balancer all marked just like you see this balancer, so I know exactly where that is. Sorry, not a half a turn, 90 degrees at a time. 90 degrees at a time, not a half a turn with this method. And that next 90 degrees will be number 8, and number 4, number 3, number 4, number 3, number 6, number 5, number 7, and number 2. Is following around a quarter of a turn, 90 degrees at a time, just the way that balancer is marked. So if you're putting an engine together, think about marking it up like that before you assemble it, when it's a lot easier, and it'll make it a lot easier. A lot of high-end balancers, by the way, have all these marks on them for you. You don't have to put them on, but this is just a balancer that I'm never going to use. So they're set. Typically what I'll do is, and once again, you don't have to be exactly at top dead center, plus or minus a few degrees is fine. When it's all done, I'll come along with a ratchet like that, just to make sure I didn't miss tightening something, and just give it a little push like that. And as I mentioned, I don't, once the engine's valve lifters are adjusted, I assemble the engine, I never adjust them again. But what I will do is, after the engine's been running for a while, just as a check, I'll go through the same process and I'll just feel them. And I can tell whether if the valve lifter is getting loose or something, then you got a usually pretty serious problem, but most of the time it's not. And then before I put the cover back on, just go along and just make sure they're all snugged up. And if you move it a little bit when you do that, it's okay. I aim for a half a turn. You can put a quarter of a turn, 3/4 of a turn, and the engine will run just fine. I wouldn't go with 0 or a full turn right now for reasons that I don't want to discuss on this video. So we got 2 lifters adjusted. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to put everything back together, put the valve covers back on, and fire it up and let you hear it run. So before they do that, tip of the day, we often forget to do it. So here's one thing I just found in my toolbox. I haven't used this for many years. If you ever have a cylinder head where the spark plug thread gets somehow damaged or tight or screwed up somehow, and obviously if the cylinder head's on the engine, you don't want to be putting the tap in there because you're going to drop filings into the engine. This device, actually made by Powerbuilt, I'm pretty sure I bought this on Amazon quite a few years ago. It actually goes into the cylinder, and then because this part is split, and once it's in the cylinder, you tighten it up till all the threads are in contact, and you draw it back out, and if there's any cuttings, they come out of the engine instead of into the engine. So These are the kind of tool you buy you hope you never have to use. But if you ever have to get in that situation, you might find it a good tool to have. So that's the tip of the day. Please like and subscribe. We're going to come back right away and we're going to fire this baby up for you. Okay, we're ready to fire Paul Vanderspek's 355. And actually it works out good because Paul's coming with his dad, Henry, today to, he wants to see this running before I take it off the stand. And the next time you'll see it, we're going to dyno it on March the 1st. It's not that far away, March the 1st. And we're going to do a comparison test. The last two 355s I built were almost the same compression ratio, very, very similar camshafts, very similar intake manifolds. We have multiple carburetors. The difference is the cylinder heads. These are retro 1970s 292 casting angle plug heads. These were used in CASCAR and NASCAR back in the day, and they were pretty much the best casts until Vortec heads came along 20 years later. So that will be a nice test, the retro stuff against the modern. The previous two engines had Promax 185cc heads on it. Both those engines made well over 400 horsepower, so it's going to be a tough challenge for these little cast iron heads. So one of the things you'll notice, the headers are not my typical headers. I had to go to Daryl's and borrow them. These are sprint car headers, and if you are thinking about buying heads, and a lot of new aftermarket cylinder heads give you a choice, angle plug or straight plug. Angle plug have some advantages. According to Bill Jenkins, they're worth 10 horsepower, 15 horsepower, and we'll find out on the dyno, but they create problems for spark plug interference. And so if you're thinking of using them, check that out first, because one of the solutions is the headers that I typically use will not go on these heads, period. You cannot get the spark plugs in. One of the solutions guys use there's specially made called shorty spark plugs that allow you to do that, but they're very, very expensive, and then you're kind of stuck with one heat range. So the angle plug is a good thing. These are sprint car headers, so lots of clearance. I also use angle plug heads on my son's race car. It's a modified, lots of clearance, not an issue. But for a street car where you got to hug the headers inside the body of the car, it could become a problem. So we're going to start it up, and so you can hear it sound. We warmed it up already with mufflers on. We're going to push it outside. This is Canadian winter. Guys watching all over the world, maybe some of you have never seen snow, so we're going to see it today. Let's fire it up. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching Gold Scratch.